Let's look at some of that external evidence now. Beginning with chapter 13 and the missionary journeys of Paul, the book of Acts intersects what we know about the Greco-Roman world in numerous ways. I'm going to give you just a sampling, and at the end, I'll give you a bibliography where you can go and look up more of this. This is just a small, incomplete sample of the points where the historical accuracy of Acts is confirmed by sources outside of the Bible. But before I begin, Bart Ehrman has an objection. He wants you to plug your ears at this point. He wants you to ignore all of the external evidence, an extraordinary thing for a historian or one claiming to be a historian to do. Why does he say that? Well, here in his own words, the affirmative side wants to argue the fact that Luke was knowledgeable about the first century and that, okay, well, that can easily be conceded. He says, of course he did. He lived in the first century. Naturally, he knows about it, but that has no relevance to the question of whether the narratives he sets in the first century happened the way he says they did. No amount of detailed confirmation is allowed to count in favor of the trustworthiness of the narratives because it could all just be common knowledge. Well, that's a clever way of trying to poison the affirmative case before it gets off the ground. Let's think about this objection. First, and this is a simple fact about the theory of knowledge, if getting historical details wrong is evidence against the historical trustworthiness of a book, like Acts, then getting them right is evidence for it. Evidence is a two-way street. You can't actually count it against in the one case and fail to count it for in the other. But maybe Ehrman could say it's only weak evidence. I mean, after all, Spider-Man stories mention the existence of the city, New York City, and we don't think that Spider-Man is history for that reason. So maybe the stuff in Luke is just like that. But the response is, it's not. The author of Acts doesn't just get things right. He gets hard things right. I think we have to guard ourselves against what I call the Wikipedia fallacy. And that's the fallacy of thinking that an ancient author like Luke could write a very detailed narrative just by looking up all the facts that he needs. There was no Wikipedia. This is a world without Wikipedia. You can't Google it. It's not there. There are no reference libraries. Such tiny libraries as they were might include a single shelf of books, and that would have things like the works of Homer in it, a few plays perhaps. You don't have massive encyclopedias, large sets of maps carefully drawn with details about them. You have to go and travel through these areas in order to be able to give a detailed account of them. Remember, as we go, Ehrman claims that the author of Acts was not a companion of Paul. So it's Google or bust. You either look it up on the internet or you are really out of luck. Well, let's see. Does he get hard things right, or does he get only very vague things right? Overland routes, cities, landmarks, political boundaries. He's got the proper location of Iconium, which is in Phrygia, rather than in Lycaonia. So that's Acts 14. In Acts 15 and 16, he's got the correct order of approach from the Cilician gates. You'd go to Derbe and then to Lystra. Would you know the proper order for traveling overland to hit two cities in the middle of Asia Minor? Where would you look it up? The proper description of Philippi as a Roman colony, the identification of its seaport as Neapolis, which is attested both in manuscripts and in some evidence from coins, Acts 16, verse 12. Notice these are just scattered through the text. Overland routes, cities, landmarks, more of these. The right location of a small river near Philippi where they go out to worship. The proper locations where travelers would spend successive nights on this journey to Thessalonica. These are towns that are about 30 miles apart. Traveling along a good road, you can make about that distance if you're an experienced walker. Sea routes and landmarks. There's a natural crossing between two correctly named ports right at the beginning of Acts 13. There's a mountain, Mount Cassius, which is within sight of Cyprus. The proper port for a ship crossing from Cyprus, the proper port that returning travelers would use. This is a port along the coast. It's not a river port. It's one where you'd go to intercept a vessel that's moving its way up the coast. The place of a conspicuous sailor's landmark, Samothrace, dominated by a mountain that's nearly a mile high, Acts 16:11. The correct implication that sea travel is the most convenient way of reaching Athens from Berea. Correct. The summer winds, the Estian winds, would favor sailing in that direction, sailing southward down the Greek peninsula toward Athens. Local customs, local beliefs. There's the depiction of philosophical debate in the agora, characteristic of Athenian life. There's the proper reaction of Greek philosophers to the bodily resurrection. There's a play by Aeschylus, the Eumenides, where he sums up the Greek view on death. Once a mortal's blood has drained into the dust, the man is dead, and then there's no return, no resurrection from the dead. At that point, it's too late. The gods themselves are out of luck. The fact that the Ephesian theater was the meeting place of the city, confirmed by inscriptional evidence dating from AD 104. So I've given you the citation for the collection of Greek inscriptional materials there. Local languages, dialects, terminology. The name Lystra is unusual, but that is in fact the correct form. The Lycaonian language was unusual because in the Hellenized society in which Paul moved, usually the language was Koine Greek, but there they had their own special language. This is mentioned in Acts 14. The form of the name Troas. This was current in the 1st century. It's an unusual form again, and we find other forms of it, but there in Acts 16:8, we get the one that is period correct. The use of the correct Athenian slang word, spermologos, seed picker. That's what they say, oh, who is this seed picker? Basically, he's this country hay seed. As well as for the court, the Areion Pagon, the hill of Ares. The expression, the great goddess Artemis, and there are inscriptions in Ephesus that tell us about that. So when we get to Ephesus in Acts 19, we get that very phrase, which we can also find inscriptional evidence for. The term Tain Theon, that's the formal designation of the goddess, to feminine form. And there's the Salutarius document and others that show us that that was the way that their goddess got referred to. Terms for ethnic identity. They've got the use of a precise ethnic designation for people who are Berean. Local inscriptions attest that. A term for Asians, Greeks in Asians, Asianoi. And we find that again attested in inscriptional evidence. Local religious practices. 2 gods are associated with Lystra. And we can find that evidence for this from Lystra itself. How do you find this out if you don't live there, if you've never traveled there? The abundance of images in Athens, an altar to an unknown god, mentioned by Pausanias and Diogenes Laertius both, neither of whom is a Christian writer. Notice Paul's reference to temples made with hands. He's speaking virtually in the shadow of the Parthenon, surrounded by other shrines of the finest classical art. Yeah, these are all temples made with hands. In Acts 19, the shrines and images of Artemis, terracotta images abound in the archaeological evidence. The locations of synagogues in Thessalonica, in Athens, in Corinth, titles of local officials, they're not all the same. The magistrates of the colony at Philippi are strategoi. There's a more general term in a few verses earlier. The term politarchs is used of magistrates in Thessalonica, but it's Areopagites in the court at Athens. Gallio in Corinth is a proconsul. And by the way, we know independently when Gallio was in Corinth, so that nails down the time very, very precisely here. The grammateus, the chief executive magistrate of Ephesus, we found that in inscriptions. The title of honor, neokoros, the temple keeper, authorized by the Romans for major cities that possess an official temple of the imperial cult, the cult of the worship of the emperor. The proper term for the assizes, courts where you could go in matters of dispute, holding court under the proconsul. There are courts, you can go to them, he says, in trying to mollify the mob at Ephesus. There are numerous other points of detail involving local industries, proper nautical terminology, the voyage and shipwreck of Paul, and so forth. No wonder that A.N. Sherwin-White summed up by saying, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted.